Kill them all. Leave no body to recover. The enemy commander spoke those words without blinking, without hesitation, without a single fragment of mercy in his voice. Then he turned to his 7 snipers positioned across the ridgeline and drew one slow finger across his throat. The signal was clear. 8 American soldiers crouched below, completely surrounded, completely unaware that 7 crosshairs were already dividing their bodies into target zones. The commander lit a cigarette and leaned back against the rock. Relaxed, certain. Already celebrating a massacre that hadn't happened yet. He had 7 of the best marksmen in the region. He had every angle covered. He had forgotten one thing. She was already watching him. Drop a comment right now. Tell me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story reaches. Subscribe and stay until the very end, because what happens next will leave you speechless. The Hindu Kush mountains of eastern Afghanistan are not a place that forgives mistakes. The altitude alone can kill a man who isn't careful. The cold seeps into your bones before sunrise and stays there long after the sun has burned the frost off the rocks. The wind doesn't blow through those ridges so much as it cuts through them, like something alive and angry, like the mountain itself is trying to remind every soldier who sets foot there that this place has been fighting invaders for thousands of years and it has never once lost. Navy SEAL Team Phantom 6 knew this. They had been operating in the region for 6 months, and every man on that team carried the mountain's lessons in the scars on their hands and the weight behind their eyes. These were not young men full of fire and ignorance. These were veterans, men who had seen things that don't wash off in the shower. Men who had learned, sometimes at the cost of people they loved, that overconfidence in these mountains was the fastest way to never go home. Their team leader was Lieutenant Commander David Reese, 34 years old. Quiet in the way that only dangerous men are quiet, not because he had nothing to say, but because he understood that words cost energy, and in the field, energy was everything. He had deep-set eyes, the color of rain on concrete, and when he looked at you, you felt like he was reading something written behind your face. His men trusted him completely. Not because he was perfect, because when things went wrong, and in that part of the world, things always went wrong, Reese was the kind of man who got quieter, not louder, who slowed down when everyone else was speeding up, who thought when every instinct in the human body was screaming to stop thinking and just run. The mission briefing had been clean, almost too clean. Intel suggested that a man known only as the Architect, a weapons coordinator responsible for supplying IED components and attack planning to enemy cells across 3 provinces, was operating out of a compound tucked into a valley between 2 ridgelines in Kunar province. The compound was modest on satellite imagery. 4 walls, 2 structures inside, a generator, a satellite dish that had been flagged 6 weeks earlier by signals intelligence. The Architect moved constantly, sleeping in different locations, changing his patterns, staying alive through paranoia and routine deception. But 3 separate intelligence sources had confirmed the same thing in the same 48-hour window. He would be at this compound. He would have documents, hard drives, maps. The kind of intelligence that, if retrieved, could roll up an entire enemy network and save dozens of American lives over the following year. Reese had studied the briefing packet for 4 hours. He had asked the right questions. He had pushed back on the timeline. He had requested updated imagery as close to mission execution as possible. What he had not been told, what nobody had told him because nobody knew, was that the Architect had been expecting exactly this kind of operation for weeks. The Architect was not a stupid man. He was, in fact, the opposite of stupid. He had survived in a profession where survival depended entirely on being smarter than the people hunting you. He had watched the patterns of American special operations in the region. He had noticed the increased surveillance drone activity over the previous month. He had interpreted the signals correctly and drawn the only logical conclusion: someone was building a case against him. Someone was coming, so he had prepared. He had brought in 7 men, not ordinary fighters, not the young, enthusiastic, undisciplined volunteers who filled the lower ranks of his network. These were professionals, men who had spent years behind a scope, men who understood angles and wind and patience and the particular silence that falls over a target right before a bullet arrives. He positioned them across the ridge lines surrounding the compound with surgical precision, creating overlapping fields of fire that covered every viable approach route into the valley. Every footpath, every dry riverbed, every rocky spine that a team of soldiers might use to advance under cover of darkness. He placed them, and then he waited. And he laughed. That laugh, that slow, satisfied, already winning laugh. SEAL Team Phantom 6 inserted by helicopter. 6 miles from the objective cross-deck to foot movement to avoid any acoustic signature that might betray their approach, and spent 3 hours moving through terrain that would have been brutal in daylight and was punishing in darkness. They moved well. They moved professionally. Reese led from the front, his navigator, Second Petty Officer Marcus Webb, tracking their route on a GPS unit he had memorized as thoroughly as a map. Because in his experience, batteries died at the worst possible moments. They reached the observation point at 0347 local time. The compound was approximately 900 meters to their southeast. Through his night vision optics, Reese could see the outlines of the walls, the faint glow of a light source inside one of the structures. He could see the satellite dish. He could see a guard moving along the inner perimeter. Everything matched the briefing. Everything looked exactly as it was supposed to look. Petty Officer First Class Danny Okafor was the first one to see something wrong. Danny was 26 years old, originally from Houston, Texas, the kind of man who always seemed to be laughing even when he wasn't, whose face defaulted to a kind of quiet, easy warmth that made people instinctively trust him. He was also one of the sharpest pair of eyes on the team. He had grown up hunting white-tailed deer in the hill country before he was old enough to drive. And something about those years of sitting still and watching the tree line had given him a quality of attention that no amount of formal training could replicate. He saw things other people didn't see. He saw the first sniper at 0352. It was a small thing, a silhouette that didn't match the rock it was resting against, just a slight irregularity in the ridge to their left, a shape that was almost right but not quite right. He tapped Reese on the shoulder, pointed, said nothing. Reese raised his optics, looked, held very still for a long moment. "I see him," Reese whispered. "Check the other ridge," Danny murmured. Reese swept his optics slowly to the right, and there it was again, another shape that didn't belong. He swept left again, then right, then up the face of the larger ridge directly ahead. He went cold, not the cold of the mountain air, a different cold, a deeper cold, the kind that starts somewhere behind your sternum and radiates outward through your chest when your brain catches up to what your eyes are seeing and sends the signal that everything has just changed. "Danny," he said very quietly, "count them." Danny was already counting. His lips moved silently as his optics moved across the ridge lines. Methodical, patient, not rushing, because rushing now would mean missing one, and missing one was the same as not counting at all. When he finished, he lowered his optics and turned to look at Reese. "7," he said, just the word, nothing else, because nothing else needed to be said. 7 snipers, positioned across multiple ridge lines, overlapping fields of fire, every approach covered, every angle watched. This was not a defensive posture assembled by amateurs. This was a kill box constructed by someone who understood exactly what they were doing, exactly who was coming, and exactly what would happen if that team tried to move in any direction toward that compound. Reese keyed his radio and called his team into a tight perimeter behind the largest boulder on the observation point. 6 faces looked at him in the darkness. He could see them clearly through the ambient glow of their equipment. He could see Danny's expression, which had gone from that familiar, easy warmth to something carefully neutral, the face a man puts on when he is working very hard to remain calm. He could see Webb, who was already doing math in his head, recalculating routes, looking for an angle that didn't exist. He could see Petty Officer Second Class Aaron Flores, the team's combat medic, who had the disconcerting habit of going completely still when the situation turned bad, like a deer in the moment before it runs. "We've got 7 sniper positions," Reese said, keeping his voice flat and factual, because flat and factual was how you gave information that couldn't be changed. "Overlapping coverage, no approach angle that doesn't cross at least 2 fields of fire simultaneously. If we move on this compound right now, we are going to take casualties before we close half the distance." Nobody argued with this, because nobody could. "Can we go around?" Webb asked. "I counted the ridge lines," Danny said quietly. "There's no around. They own the high ground in every direction." "Extract and replan," Flores offered. "We extract now, we lose the target," Reese said. "Intel says he moves before dawn. If we're not in that compound in the next 90 minutes, he's gone, and we don't know when we get another window." Silence. That particular kind of silence that falls over a group of men when they are all holding the same impossible equation in their heads and none of them can find an answer that makes the math work. It is a heavy silence. It has texture and weight. It presses down on you. Too many snipers on us, Reese said, finally speaking into the radio net because his support element needed to understand the situation. We can't move. And that was the moment. That was the exact moment when a voice came back over the radio that none of them had expected to hear. Not the voice of the mission coordinator back at the forward operating base, not the voice of their air support. A different voice, a calm voice, a voice that carried in it something they couldn't immediately name. Not arrogance, not bravado, but a quality of absolute settled certainty that belongs only to people who have spent a very long time being very good at something the rest of the world knows nothing about. Phantom 6, this is Overwatch 1. I have eyes on your position and on all 7 threat positions. I've been on this ridge for 72 hours. I know their patterns. I know their rotation schedule. I know which one is the most alert and which one gets careless after midnight. I can clear your path. Reese looked at Danny. Danny looked at Reese. Neither of them had been briefed on any Overwatch element attached to this operation. Reese keyed his radio. Overwatch 1, identify yourself. A brief pause. Marine Scout Sniper, Sergeant Emily Carter, 2nd Battalion 7th Marines. Another silence. Shorter this time, but more charged. Carter, Reese said carefully. How long have you been out here? 72 hours. Alone. Yes, sir. Webb made a sound that wasn't quite a word. It was the sound a man makes when a piece of information arrives that his brain needs a moment to process because it doesn't fit into any category he has ready. 3 days. Alone. On a rocky ridge above enemy territory in the cold, without moving enough to be seen for 72 hours. What's your distance to the nearest threat position, Reese asked. 860 meters to Sniper 1, slightly farther to the others. Reese did the math automatically. 860 meters was not an impossible shot for a trained military sniper. But doing it once in the dark under pressure without a spotter was one thing. Doing it 7 times sequentially against targets who would begin reacting to the sound of the first shot, or even the sound of its absence if she was suppressed, was something else entirely. Carter, he said, walk me through what you're proposing. And she did. She spoke for 3 minutes and 40 seconds. Reese timed it without thinking the way he timed everything because in this work time was a physical substance, something you could spend or lose or run out of, and you always needed to know exactly how much you had left. She described each sniper's position with coordinates precise enough to match his own observations. She described the rotation pattern she had documented over 3 days, which positions were always manned, which ones rotated every 45 minutes. Which sniper made the mistake of lighting a cigarette at irregular intervals that created a momentary predictable target profile? She described the sequence in which she intended to engage them, starting with the most dangerous and moving to the most alert, then the easiest, then back up the difficulty curve to end with the one who was most likely to detect the operation before it was complete. When she finished, Reese was quiet for a moment. You've been planning this, he said. For 36 hours, she said. You were planning it before we even got here. I was tracking the architect's defensive posture as part of my original tasking, she said. When the sniper network started coming into place, I adjusted. What was your original tasking? I'm not at liberty to discuss that on this net, sir. Reese almost smiled. Almost. Carter, what is your confidence level on this plan? There was no hesitation. High, she said, with one caveat. What's the caveat? If I miss or have a malfunction on any engagement before I reach Sniper 7, the remaining positions will go to full alert. At that point, the advantage is theirs, not mine. I want you to know that before I start. Reese looked at his team. One by one, 6 faces in the dark. He didn't ask them what they thought. He didn't need to. He knew what they thought. He knew it because he thought the same thing. They had one option. One woman alone on a ridge who had been watching over them for 3 days without them knowing she was there. Carter, Reese said. Sir? What's your call sign again? Overwatch 1. All right, Overwatch 1. He took a breath. Clear our path. Copy that, Phantom 6. And then for the first time in nearly an hour, Emily Carter moved. She had been lying so still for so long that the act of preparing to fire felt like waking up from a deep sleep, except that everything inside her was the opposite of sleepy. Everything inside her was precise and concentrated and running at full speed. She had been in this state before, not often, but enough times to know it, to recognize it, to trust it. It was the state that her mentor, Gunnery Sergeant William Hayes, had described to her years ago as the zone of maximum performance, and it felt less like excitement and more like clarity, like everything irrelevant had been removed. Like all that remained was the calculation and the discipline and the understanding of what needed to happen next. She settled behind her rifle and found her first target, 862 meters. She had measured it so many times over the past 36 hours that the number existed in her head the way her own birthday did, instantly, without effort. She had calculated the atmospheric conditions, the temperature differential between the valley floor and her position, the wind. Always the wind in those mountains, always changing, always trying to cheat you out of the shot you had earned through patience and intelligence. She had a solution. She had had it for hours. She was simply waiting for the moment to use it. Reese's voice came quietly over her earpiece. Phantom 6 is set. We'll hold position until you call clear on all 7. Understood, Emily said. Going silent now. Do not move unless I call it, or you hear nothing for 12 minutes, in which case assume the operation has failed and extract immediately. Copy. She went silent and found her breath and waited for the moment she had spent 3 days building toward. The enemy commander's laugh echoed somewhere in her memory. He had laughed because he believed he had thought of everything. He had not thought of her. Nobody ever did. That was Emily knew exactly the point. She exhaled halfway, held, and began. The first shot was the hardest, not because the distance was the greatest or because the target was the most alert, but because the first shot was the one that committed her to everything that followed. Once she fired, the clock started. Once she fired, every decision she had made over the past 3 days was either correct or not, and there would be no more time to reconsider, no more time to adjust the plan, no more time to be anything other than exactly who she was and exactly what she was capable of. The suppressor reduced the sound of the shot to something that would not carry far in that wind, in that dark across those ridges. The first sniper went still in a way that was very different from the stillness of a man waiting patiently. Emily was already moving to the second target. She had 12 minutes, and she had trained her entire adult life for the next 12 minutes. Behind her on the observation point, Danny Okafor watched the first enemy position go silent through his optics. He watched for a reaction from the second position, saw nothing. He didn't say anything. He just breathed and waited and trusted. 3 days earlier, he would have told you that trust like that had to be earned, that you couldn't put your life in the hands of someone you'd never met, someone you'd never seen in action, someone who was nothing but a voice on a radio in a story you didn't yet know. He would have been right, but some people he was learning didn't need to introduce themselves before they proved themselves. Some people just showed up and did what nobody else could do and changed everything. Reese pressed his back against the boulder and watched the second ridgeline through his optics and thought about what it meant to trust someone you couldn't see. He thought about it for approximately 4 seconds. Then he let it go, and he trusted her, because in the end, that was all he could do. And because something in that voice, that calm, certain, completely unhurried voice, had told him in the language that experienced soldiers use to understand each other without words, that she had already earned it. The mountain was quiet, the wind moved through the ridges, and somewhere in the dark, invisible, a woman with a rifle was doing something that most people would later say was impossible. She didn't find that word useful. Possible and impossible. Hayes had told her once, are words invented by people who haven't yet decided how far they're willing to go. Emily Carter had decided a long time ago. She was already on the third target, and the night was still young. The first shot had already left the barrel. Emily didn't watch the target fall. She was already gone mentally, physically, entirely to the second position. That was the discipline. That was the thing Hayes had drilled into her so deep it had become reflex rather than thought. You never admire your work in the middle of the work. You never look back. Looking back is for people who have time to look back, and in those 12 minutes, time was not something Emily Carter had the luxury of wasting on anything that wasn't the next target, the next calculation, the next breath. The second sniper was positioned 112 meters farther than the first, slightly elevated, tucked into a natural alcove in the rock face that gave him protection on three sides. Emily had spent an entire afternoon mentally, because she couldn't physically move without compromising her position, studying that alcove. She had watched the second sniper shift his body weight 4 times in a 6-hour period, always to his left, always favoring his left elbow on the rock as his right shoulder settled into the stock. She knew which side of that alcove had the opening. She knew the angle. She knew exactly where he would be sitting in his own darkness when her bullet arrived. 974 meters. She exhaled. She fired. Back on the observation point, Danny Okafor's breath caught in his throat as he watched the second position go still. He tracked immediately to the third position. Nothing moved. He scanned the fourth. Nothing. He swept back to the first. Still dark. Still silent. He pressed his radio transmit button once briefly, the way Reese had instructed, a single click that meant, "I see it, I'm tracking." No words. Words cost time. Words could carry on the wind in ways that a single click could not. Reese received the click and said nothing. He was watching the compound. The guard on the inner perimeter was still moving in his regular pattern. Short loop, turn, short loop, turn. The man had no idea that the mountain around him was changing. 2 down, Danny murmured so quietly the words barely existed. Reese nodded. 5 to go. And then Aaron Flores, the combat medic who almost never spoke unless it was absolutely necessary, said something that nobody expected. "She's not just shooting," he said. "She's doing it in a sequence. Look at the position she's hitting. She's going in order of reaction time. Most dangerous first, then the ones most likely to spot the pattern in time to warn the others." Reese looked at him. "You're reading her targeting logic," Reese said. "I'm trying to foster human," Flores said. "And if I'm right, she's about to skip the position at our 10 o'clock and go to the one at 2 o'clock instead. Because the one at 2 o'clock has a line of sight to the first position that she hit, and if he looks that direction in the next 40 seconds, he didn't finish the sentence. Because at that exact moment, the third shot reached out from somewhere in the dark mountain above them, and the position at 2 o'clock went silent. Nobody said anything for 3 full seconds. Then Danny turned and looked at Flores with an expression that didn't have a clean name. It was somewhere between respect and the particular unease that comes from realizing someone is operating at a level you didn't know existed. "She's 4 moves ahead of us," Danny said quietly. "At least," Flores replied. High above them, Emily was already solving the fourth problem. The fourth sniper was the one she had marked in her notes. Mental notes, because she carried no physical documentation. Never had, never would another lesson from Hayes as the sleeper. Not because he slept, because he moved like someone conserving energy for something like a man who had learned to make himself appear less dangerous than he was. He rarely repositioned. He didn't fidget. When the other snipers made small adjustments, shifted their weight, stretched their necks, the sleeper stayed locked in place with a discipline that Emily recognized and respected and found genuinely threatening. He was the one she had been most worried about. Not because of his skill level, though that was real, but because of his stillness. A still man notices things. A still man feels the change in the atmosphere when something around him has shifted even before his conscious mind can articulate what has shifted. And she had already fired 3 times, and even with suppression, even with the wind carrying the acoustic signature away from his position. The sleeper was the kind of man who might feel that something was different about the last few minutes without knowing exactly what. She needed to be on him before he trusted that feeling enough to act on it. 1,031 meters. This was her longest shot of the sequence. She breathed through the calculation. Wind from the northwest at approximately 7 knots at her position, but she had watched the way dust moved in the valley below at different times of night, and she knew the wind behaved differently in the saddle between the 2 ridge lines that it bent, that it accelerated slightly as it moved through the narrowing terrain. She adjusted for it, not dramatically, just enough. The kind of adjustment that only reveals itself as correct in the fraction of a second after the trigger breaks. She fired. The sleeper, to his credit, had been in the process of turning his head. He had felt it. He had felt something. But he was 73 years of age behind the experience of his instincts, and instincts that old are fast, but they are not faster than a bullet that is already in the air. The 4th position went still. 4 minutes and 11 seconds had elapsed since she fired the first shot. Back on the observation point, Reese's radio crackled with a new voice. The mission coordinator at the forward operating base call sign Bravo Control had been monitoring the net in silence. Now he spoke. Phantom 6, this is Bravo Control. We're seeing something on the Overwatch feed, but we need confirmation. What is your status? Reese kept his eyes on the compound and said very calmly, Bravo Control, we are in progress. Stand by. Phantom 6, I need a sit rep. We don't have any Overwatch element tasked to your AO. Who is Bravo Control, Reese said, and there was something in his voice that he didn't usually let into his voice. Not anger, but a kind of absolute finality, the sound of a door closing. I will give you a full sit rep when I have one. Right now, I need you to stay off this net for approximately 8 minutes. Can you do that for me? A pause. Copy Phantom 6, 8 minutes, standing by. Reese clicked off and turned back to his optics. 3 minutes, Danny said quietly. She's got 3 left, and she's almost halfway through the time. She'll make it, Webb said. He said it with a conviction that surprised even him. He hadn't meant to say it with that much certainty, but when it came out, he realized he believed it. Emily was moving through the 5th engagement. The 5th sniper was the careless one, the one who lit cigarettes at irregular intervals, the one whose body language across all 3 days of observation had told her that he was capable but bored, that he had been sitting on that ridge line long enough to start believing that nothing was going to happen. The dangerous ones Hayes had told her are not always the most skilled. Sometimes the most dangerous enemy is the one who is still alert on day 3 when everyone else has started to mentally check out. And sometimes the most vulnerable target is the most skilled man who has convinced himself it's going to be a quiet night. The 5th sniper was not a quiet night. He was or had been smoking. The ember of the cigarette was the last thing Emily used to confirm his exact position before she settled her crosshairs and ended the question. She fired. 5 down, 7 minutes and 2 seconds. She's doing it, Danny said, and he didn't even try to hide the awe in his voice. The trained professional, careful with his emotions, Danny Okafor, who had been in firefights that would have broken most people, was openly, genuinely awed. She's actually doing it. Eyes on the compound, Reese said quietly. Not harshly, just a reminder. Because they still had a mission. Because Emily Carter finishing what she started was one thing, but them staying focused on what happened next was another, and he needed his team in both places all at once. Danny got his eyes back on the compound. The guard was still on his loop. The light inside the structure was still on. The architect was still there. And then everything changed. Not with a sound, not with a flash of light or a movement Emily could have predicted or planned for, because the thing that changed was random in the truest, most uncooperative sense of the word. It was the kind of random that combat veterans know is always out there, but always waiting the variable that no amount of preparation can eliminate, because the universe reserves the right to insert it whenever it wants. The 6th sniper stood up, not because he had heard something, not because he had seen something, not because his instincts were screaming at him the way the sleepers had been. He stood up because he needed to stretch, because he had been lying still for 4 hours and his lower back was cramping, and he made the most human decision imaginable. He shifted his position. He straightened, he rolled his shoulders. He was standing upright in the open for approximately 4 seconds. And in those 4 seconds, Emily's rifle suffered a malfunction. The bolt failed to cycle completely, a partial feed, the kind of mechanical failure that happens in training maybe once every several hundred rounds, and that always seems to happen in the field at the moment when you most absolutely cannot afford it. Emily felt it before she heard it, felt the wrongness in the bolt's travel, the resistance where there should have been none, felt the round that was supposed to be chambered hanging half in and half out of the feed mechanism. 4 seconds. The 6th sniper was standing. She had 4 seconds before he sat back down and the window closed. Her hands moved. Not frantically, not with the wild energy of panic, with the controlled, precise urgency of someone who has drilled this exact scenario so many times that her muscles knew what to do before her conscious mind finished issuing the order. She ran the malfunction drill. Slap rack, assess. The round ejected. A fresh round chambered. The bolt closed. All of this in 3 seconds. She found the 6th sniper in her scope on the 4th second. He was in the act of lowering himself back to the ground. She fired at 3 seconds and 89 100ths. The sixth position went silent. For a moment, a very brief moment, shorter than a breath, Emily allowed herself to feel something. Not relief, not pride, just a single raw physical acknowledgement of what had just happened. Her hands were completely steady. Her heart rate, she knew without checking, had not exceeded 70 beats per minute throughout the entire sequence. But the mind and the body are separate systems sometimes, and her mind right now was very clearly aware of how close that had been. Then she let it go. One target remained, the seventh sniper, the one she had saved for last on purpose. She had designated him internally in the private language she used to organize threat assessments as the primary problem. Not because he was the most dangerous in the traditional sense, the sleeper had been her most operationally significant threat, but the seventh sniper was the most experienced man in the architect's defensive network, and experience was something Emily understood deeply, because experience was what she had also built herself on, piece by piece, lesson by lesson, mistake by mistake. Experienced men were not predictable in the way that inexperienced men were predictable. Inexperienced men made errors based on lack of knowledge. Experienced men made adjustments based on exactly the kind of information that was now available to the seventh sniper, because in the last 8 minutes, 6 of his colleagues had gone silent without warning. And a man who had been in enough battles knew that 6 simultaneous communications failures were not a technical problem. They were a threat. Emily could see him through her optics. He was moving, not running, not panicking, moving with the measured, purposeful urgency of someone who has already done the math and doesn't like the answer. He was changing position, abandoning the post he had occupied for 3 days, working his way along the ridgeline toward a secondary position. Emily had observed him visit twice. She had logged it, noted. It worried about it. That would give him a wider view of the terrain and, more importantly, a direct line of sight to the compound's exterior wall where a guard was positioned. If he reached that secondary position, he could warn them. Not over the radio. He might not trust the radio at this point. He might warn them the old way, the simple way, the way that worked regardless of communication equipment. A signal, a light pattern, a sound. 3 quick shots into the air that meant danger, abort, scatter. Emily estimated 30 seconds before he reached the secondary position. She adjusted her aim, tracking him as he moved, calculating his speed and direction, building the lead in her scope that would put the bullet where he was going to be rather than where he currently was. Moving targets. Hayes had made her shoot moving targets for 6 months before he let her shoot anything stationary. He had stood behind her with a stopwatch in a particular brand of disappointed silence that was more motivating than anything he could have said, and he had made her do it again and again until leading a moving target was as natural as breathing. A static target, he had told her, is a gift. A moving target is a test, and life will give you far more tests than gifts. She tracked. She calculated. She waited for the precise moment in his movement when his path intersected with her solution. And back on the observation point, Reese's radio crackled. Not Bravo Control this time, not Emily. It was the seventh sniper's radio, and they were receiving it because Webb had been scanning frequencies since the operation began, and he had found the enemy net 14 minutes ago and had said nothing about it because there had been nothing worth reporting. Now there was. The seventh sniper was transmitting. Not words, a pattern of clicks, fast, deliberate, organized. He's alerting them, Webb said sharply. He's using a click code. He doesn't know the details, but he knows something is wrong and he's telling them. Can you block it? Danny said. Not in time. Carter Reese said into his radio, and his voice had changed, not loudness, but intensity, the way a voice changes when the stakes have shifted from high to critical. Carter, he's transmitting. He's alerting the compound. You need to... I know, Emily said. Just those 2 words. I know. And then a single final sound moved through the suppressor and through the wind and across 918 meters of dark Afghan mountain air. The seventh sniper's transmission ended mid-click. The radio went silent. The mountain went silent. For 8 seconds, nobody on the observation point moved or spoke, or it seemed breathed. Then Danny Okafor lowered his optics very slowly. He turned and looked at Reese. His expression was the face of a man who has just witnessed something he will spend the rest of his life trying to find the right words for and mostly failing. How many clicks did he get out? Reese asked Webb quietly. Webb checked his frequency scanner. Partial sequence, maybe 2 full clicks in a fraction of a third. Is that enough to trigger a response from the compound? Webb was quiet for a moment. Depends on what the code means. If it's a standard alert pattern, 2 clicks might mean anything. They might ignore it, might think it's a radio error. Or they might not, Flores said. Or they might not, Webb agreed. Reese looked at the compound. The guard on the inner perimeter had stopped his loop. He was standing still, facing outward toward the ridgelines. His posture had changed. Still, listening. He heard something, Danny said. Or felt something, Flores said. Phantom 6. Emily's voice came over the radio, and even now, even after 12 minutes of something that defied the ordinary vocabulary of combat, her voice was level. All 7 threat positions are clear. You have a window. Compound security may be partially alerted. I recommend you move now within the next 2 minutes before they reach full readiness. Reese was already on his feet. Team, we're moving, he said. Now, standard wedge, I'm on point. Danny left flank. Webb right. Flores, you're with me. Move fast and move quiet. The team was moving before he finished the sentence. As they began their advance toward the compound, Reese keyed his radio one final time. Carter. Sir, you just did something that I'm going to have a very hard time explaining in my after-action report. The briefest pause. And then for the first time since she had spoken over that radio, Emily Carter's voice carried something other than pure operational precision. It was small, it was quick, but it was there. Put it down as effective fire support, sir. Copy that, Overwatch 1. Good luck, Phantom 6. Reese moved into the dark. But what none of them knew, not Reese, not Danny, not even Emily from her ridgeline, was what those partial clicks from the 7 sniper had actually transmitted. What code they carried. What response they might have already triggered inside the walls of that compound in the mind of a man who had spent years surviving precisely because he knew when to run and when to fight and when to do something that nobody expected. The architect was still in the building, but the architect was now awake, and the mission that had just become possible was about to become something far more complicated than anyone on that mountainside had planned for. Reese reached the first wall of the compound at 7 minutes and 44 seconds after Emily's final shot. He pressed his back against the exterior and listened. From somewhere inside behind the wall, he heard something. Not a guard, not a weapon being readied. A voice, calm, low, speaking in a dialect that Reese's limited Pashto couldn't fully parse, but that his instincts translated clearly enough. Someone inside that compound was already on a radio of his own, and he wasn't calling for help. He was giving instructions. Reese looked back at his team, 3 faces in the dark, and made a hand signal that meant the same thing in every special operations unit he had ever worked with. It meant this just got harder, Danny acknowledged with a nod. And somewhere above them on the ridgeline, invisible in the darkness, she had made her home for 3 days. Emily Carter heard the change in the radio traffic on the enemy frequency and understood exactly what it meant before anyone on the ground had time to tell her. She had cleared the path, but the path had just opened into something else entirely, and she made a decision. The same kind of decision she had made 72 hours ago when she first observed the sniper network forming around this compound and understood that her original tasking had just become secondary to something larger, something more immediate, something that only she was in a position to do anything about. She had not been ordered to stay. She had not been given authorization to expand her role beyond the sniper suppression task. She was technically mission complete. She stayed anyway, because that was who Emily Carter was. And Victoria Romano, who had run that house for 11 years, who had buried 19 men and knew all their mothers' names, looked around a kitchen at 6 in the morning and understood finally and completely that she had lost. That is the thing about people like Victoria. Losing is not what breaks them. It's being seen losing. She crossed the kitchen in 4 steps. When he had said something she hadn't fully understood at the time and had understood more and more clearly with every year that followed. You are not a Moretti, Victoria said. You are a fat girl who got lucky with a contract. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. A 7-year-old girl started to cry. And in the doorway with his coat still on, 4 seconds home from a night nobody would ever write down, Dominic Moretti had heard every word. 6:02 in the morning and nobody in that kitchen moved. The book was in the trash under 40 men's dinner with a heel print on it, and a 7-year-old girl was crying on a counter, and Dominic Moretti was standing in the doorway with his coat still on. Victoria heard the room change before she turned around. She heard it in the breathing. She turned around. Mr. Moretti. He didn't answer her. Sir, I was. Sal. Sal came off the wall. Boss, take the children out. Boss, take them out, Sal, now. Sal went to the counter and put out his arms, and the 9-year-old looked at Rose, not at Sal, because in 9 days she had learned exactly who to look at in a room, and Rose nodded once and said, Go on with Sal, sweetheart. He's the nicest man in this house, and he'll let you have a soda for breakfast. I will, Sal said. I absolutely will. They went out. The door closed. Webb was already at the wall beside him, scanner in hand, earpiece and head tilted. At the angle he always tilted his head when he was concentrating hard enough that the rest of his body forgot to hold a normal posture. Sporadic traffic, short bursts. They're not panicking, but they're talking to someone. Can't identify who. Can you break the content? Working on it. A pause. One word I'm catching consistently. Same word repeated. Sounds like a name or a designation. I can't be certain. What does it sound like? Webb said it quietly in Pashto. Flores, who had 2 more years of language school than any of them, went still. That's not a name, he said. That's a status word. It means something like the eagle has left the nest. Everyone on that wall understood simultaneously what that meant. The architect wasn't in the compound anymore, or he was in the process of leaving. Reese made the call in under 2 seconds because that was all the time he had. We're going in, now, fast and loud if we have to. Danny, you're on the door. Webb, you follow me. Flores rear security. Go! Danny was already moving. The door to the compound's interior structure wasn't locked. It was barricaded, which was a different problem and a faster one to solve, and Danny Okafor solved it with his shoulder, and the particular kind of controlled violence that comes from a man who has done this exact thing many times before and has learned to commit to it completely rather than halfway, because halfway gets you hurt. The door gave, they went in. The first room was empty, not recently vacated empty, in the way a room is empty when it was never really used for living, when it was a staging area, a waiting room, a place things passed through rather than stayed in. There were crates against one wall, communications equipment on a folding table, a map pinned to the wall with notations in a script Reese couldn't read, but photographed immediately with the small camera he carried for exactly this purpose. Room clear, Danny called from the left. Hallway clear, Webb said from ahead. Reese moved through the hallway and into the second room and stopped. There was a man sitting at a table, not standing, not running, not reaching for a weapon, sitting, completely still. Both hands flat on the surface of the table, palms down, in the specific posture of someone who has made a decision and is communicating that decision through body language, because the alternative, the weapon-reaching alternative, would end very badly, and he knows it. He was older than Reese expected, late 50s, maybe 60, a beard that had more gray in it than dark. Eyes that were calm in a way that took Reese a moment to identify, because calm in a situation like this was either the calm of someone who had accepted what was coming, or the calm of someone who knew something you didn't. Is this the architect? Webb said from behind Reese. I don't know yet, Reese said. And then to the man at the table in the limited Pashto he carried, your name. The man smiled. Small, patient. The smile of a man who has held a good hand for a long time and doesn't feel the need to show it prematurely. He answered in English. My name, he said, is not the important question. The important question is where the rest of my men are going to be in approximately 4 minutes. The room temperature seemed to drop. Reese kept his rifle on the man and kept his voice flat. What does that mean? It means, the man said still with that small patient smile, that the 7 men you eliminated on the ridgeline were not my entire security force. They were the visible layer, the outermost ring. He paused to let that land. There are 12 more, mobile, converging on this compound from 3 directions as we speak. They received the partial transmission from position 7 approximately 9 minutes ago. They have been moving since then. Reese's jaw tightened. He did not let it show beyond that. You're lying, Danny said from the doorway, but his voice had the particular quality of a man who is hoping very hard that he's right. Why would I lie? The man said reasonably. You have a rifle pointed at my face. What exactly do I gain from lying to you right now? 14 minutes and 33 seconds since Emily's first shot. Reese keyed his radio. Carter, Overwatch 1, come in. Emily's response was immediate. I'm here. We have a possible second security element. Mobile. 12 personnel converging from multiple directions. Do you have eyes on anything consistent with that? A pause that lasted exactly 4 seconds. To anyone who didn't know Emily Carter, 4 seconds might have seemed brief. To Reese, who had already calibrated his understanding of how she operated in the last 20 minutes, 4 seconds meant she was seeing something, organizing it, and preparing to report it with precision, rather than rushing words out that she'd have to correct. Yes, she said. I have movement on 2 vectors, northeast and southwest. I was tracking them as potential patrol elements, but the timing and direction are consistent with a converge. I count 9 so far, possibly more I'm not seeing. Can you? No, she said, cutting him off cleanly but without harshness. I can support your extraction, but I cannot suppress 12 mobile targets across 3 converging vectors simultaneously. The geometry doesn't work. I'd be repositioning constantly and losing time between shots. She was right. Reese knew she was right before he finished forming the question. What's my extraction window, he asked. Narrowing, she said. The northeast element is faster. I'd estimate you have between 4 and 6 minutes before the first wave reaches effective fire range of the compound. 4 minutes. Reese looked at the man at the table. You planned this, he said. I planned many things, the man said. The 7 snipers on the ridge were bait. The man tilted his head slightly. The smile changed. It went from patient to something else. Something that, if Reese had to name it, he would have called appreciative. The smile of a man who has just had his work correctly diagnosed. The 7 positions were designed to stop your team at the observation point long enough for my mobile reserve to complete its positioning. When the snipers were eliminated, which I will admit I did not anticipate happening, in the manner it did, the reserve was already in motion. The trigger was Position 7's partial transmission. 2 clicks were enough. 2 clicks, Webb said from behind Reese. 2 clicks, the man confirmed. We don't always need complete messages. Sometimes the incomplete message tells you more than the complete one would. 23 seconds had passed since Emily gave the 4-minute estimate, which meant Reese now had somewhere between 3.5 and 5.5 minutes. He made 3 decisions simultaneously: collect what was collectible in this room, extract the man at the table as a priority intelligence asset, and get his team moving before the window closed. Webb stripped the table. Everything. Hard drives, documents, the map off the wall, all of it. 60 seconds. Danny on me. He crossed to the man at the table and put a hand on his shoulder, not roughly but firmly, the grip of someone communicating that the next phase of events was not negotiable. You're coming with us. The man stood without resistance. I expected as much, he said. You expected to be captured, Danny said. I expected this operation to end in one of 2 ways, the man said as Reese moved him toward the door. Either your team died on the approach and I disappeared before dawn, or your team reached me and I became worth more to you alive than as a footnote. Given what just happened to my ridgeline, he glanced in what he apparently estimated to be the direction of Emily's position with a look that was almost respectful. I find myself in the second category. You're very calm about this, Danny said. I've been captured before, the man said simply. Outside, Emily's voice came over the radio with a new urgency that was still characteristically not panic. Phantom 6 Northeast element is moving faster than I estimated, revising your window to 3 minutes, possibly less. I have visual on 4 personnel at 800 meters northeast. They are running. Copy, Reese said. We're moving. They came out of the structure into the compound's interior space, and Reese oriented immediately toward the extraction route, the southwestern exit from the valley, the same route they had used for ingress, which was now potentially compromised if the southwestern converging element was as close as Emily thought. Carter, he said, moving fast now, the man from the table. The architect, almost certainly though nobody had confirmed it officially, moving with them at a pace that suggested he was not going to cause friction on the physical extraction, even if his words so far had been calibrated to maximum psychological disruption. Southwest route. What's the status? Southwest element is slower, Emily said. I have 3 personnel at approximately 1,400 meters. They will not reach effective range before you clear the valley if you move now and move fast. And the 3rd vector. Southeast, I count 5. But the terrain is working against them. They're having to navigate a rockfall to close the distance. They're the least immediate threat. So northeast is the problem. Northeast is the problem, she confirmed. Can you slow them down? The briefest pause. I can buy you time, but I need to reposition. I'm going to go off the air for approximately 90 seconds. 90 seconds. Reese acknowledged and moved. The team moved with him, practiced and fast, Webb with a bag over his shoulder containing everything from the table, Danny on the left flank with the prisoner controlled between them, Flores covering their rear with the focused attention of a man who understands that the most dangerous threat in a rear security situation is the one you hear first, but see a fraction of a second too late. 50 seconds passed. No Emily on the radio. 1 minute. Where is she? Danny said not to anyone in particular, not really a question, more the kind of thing a person says when the silence is too heavy to carry without making a sound. Repositioning, Reese said. She said 90 seconds. That was 78, Danny said. Then we have 12 more. 82 seconds in a shot reached them from somewhere different than Emily's original position. Higher, more lateral. She had moved significantly, repositioned under pressure in darkness while staying invisible, and she had done it in 82 seconds. Northeast element just became less of a problem, she said over the radio, returning to the net as cleanly as if she had simply stepped out of the room for a moment. Lead element is down. Remaining 3 have taken cover. They will resume advance in approximately 45 seconds when they determine the threat vector. That buys us the valley crossing, Reese said. It should, Emily said. Move, don't slow down. They didn't slow down. The man between Danny and Reese moved without complaint, without dragging his feet, without the kind of passive resistance that detainees sometimes use to buy their network time. He kept up. He watched everything with those calm, observant eyes. And at one point, as they moved fast through the dark, he said something that Reese almost missed because he was tracking the terrain ahead and listening to 3 radio channels simultaneously. Your shooter, the man said, on the ridge. What about her? Reese said. Yeah. Not a question, a warning. She moved position in the dark in under 90 seconds without losing her firing solution. I want you to understand, I have worked with highly trained military personnel for 20 years. What she just did is not something I have seen before. Good, Danny said from the man's other side without looking at him. Remember that feeling. They hit the valley floor and began the climb toward the extraction route, and the terrain changed under their feet from the compound's packed dirt to loose rock, the kind that shifts and slides and punishes speed. With noise, and noise right now was their enemy, as surely as the men converging behind them. Flores stumbled, caught himself, said nothing, kept moving. Webb's bag hit a rock outcropping, and he spun with it, absorbing the impact, protecting the contents, not slowing down, in all-in-one fluid motion that spoke to a kind of operational competence that nobody ever trained for specifically, but that you either developed or didn't. 2 minutes to the ridgeline, Reese said more to himself than to his team. 2 minutes. Emily's voice came back, and this time there was something new in it. Not fear. Emily Carter's voice did not carry fear in any register Reese had been able to detect in the time he'd known her, which was now approximately 35 minutes and felt like 3 years. But there was urgency in it. The specific urgency of someone reporting a problem before they've solved it, which was unusual enough to make Reese's attention sharpen immediately. Phantom 6, account. I have a visual problem. The southeast element, the 5 I told you were slowed by the rockfall, one of them found a route through. He's at 600 meters southeast and he has an angle on your current position. 600 meters, moving, one target, with a clear line. Can you? I'm working on it, she said. I need 15 seconds. Do not stop moving, but adjust your bearing 5 degrees north to put that ridge spur between you and his angle. 5 degrees north, in the dark, while moving fast, on loose rock. Reese didn't hesitate. He adjusted. The team adjusted with him because they trusted him the way he had trusted Emily, and that chain of trust was the only thing holding the operation together. 10 seconds, 12. A shot from Emily's repositioned location. He's down, she said. Maintain current bearing, 14 degrees to the ridgeline. Copy, Reese said. And then because something in him needed to say it, Carter, you doing all right up there? A pause. Define all right, she said. And despite everything, despite the darkness, the pursuing enemy elements, The loose rock under his boots, the intelligence prize between him and Danny, the 47 things that could still go wrong between here and the helicopter. Reese almost smiled. Functional, he said. Are you functional? Yes, sir. Functional. Good enough. They hit the ridgeline at 12 minutes and 40 seconds after leaving the compound, and Reese called the extraction bird as soon as he crested the high ground and had enough altitude for clean radio contact with the FOB. He gave coordinates. He gave a status report that was necessarily incomplete because several of the things that had happened in the last 30 minutes were going to require a great deal of time and privacy to properly explain. Bravo Control came back immediately. Phantom 6, we have an asset confirmation request. The individual in your custody, can you confirm identity? Reese looked at the man standing 4 feet from him on the ridgeline, hands zip-tied behind him, now that same patient expression on his face watching the horizon with the look of a man who has lived through enough that horizons no longer surprise him. Negative confirmation, Reese said, but I am highly confident. Copy. We're spinning the bird, 18 minutes to your position. 18 minutes, Reese turned to his team. Hold position. Flores, get eyes behind us. Webb, start working those ROS drives if you can. I want to know what we're carrying before we land. Webb already had a drive out of the bag and a field reader in his hand. He moved slightly away from the group, using the light discipline they all maintained automatically, and went to work. The man, the architect, sat down on a rock without being told. He looked up at Reese. Your shooter is still on the ridgeline, he said. It wasn't a question. She's providing overwatch for our extraction, Reese said. He didn't know why he was answering. Something about the man's tone made silence feel like a missed opportunity. She has been alone up there for 3 days, the architect said. I knew someone was there. I detected the signs, movement patterns, slight disturbances. I sent 2 men to investigate on day 2. He paused. They didn't find anything. Reese said nothing. She was better than 2 experienced trackers, the architect said, and better than 7 experienced snipers, and apparently better than a mobile reserve element I spent 3 weeks positioning. He looked out at the ridgeline in the dark. Who is she? Nobody you're ever going to worry about again, Danny said from 6 feet away. On the contrary, the man said quietly, she is the only thing I intend to think about for a very long time. Webb looked up from the field reader. His expression had changed. Not dramatically, Webb was not a man of dramatic expressions, but enough. Enough that Reese crossed to him immediately. What Reese said, Webb turned the reader slightly so Reese could see the screen. These aren't operational files, he said quietly. Or not just operational files. There's a roster here. Names, positions, cell affiliations. I'm reading it partially, but Reese, this isn't just his network. This looks like a regional directory. Multiple networks, multiple countries. Reese stared at the screen. How many names, he said. I'd need more time to count accurately, but at a rough estimate, Webb looked at him. Hundreds. The wind moved through the ridgeline. Below them, somewhere in the valley, the remaining converging elements were still out there, reorganizing, trying to understand what had happened to their operation. Above them, the stars were the particular, sharp brightness of high altitude, the kind that looks different than stars anywhere else, more present, more serious. And somewhere on the mountain, invisible, still Emily Carter was watching all of it. Carter, Reese said over the radio. Still here, she said. We're solid on the ridgeline. 18 minutes to bird. I'll hold until your wheel's up. Reese started to acknowledge and then stopped. Something in the radio had changed. A quality of the silence around her voice. A texture that hadn't been there before. Carter, he said. Sir? What's your status, honestly? The pause this time was longer than any she had taken since the first transmission. And when she answered, her voice was exactly the same as it had always been. Level precise control, but underneath it, if you were listening very carefully, if you had spent enough time around people who were holding themselves together through discipline alone, you could hear the weight of 72 hours pressing against the surface of that control. I'm tired, she said. Just that. I'm tired, sir, but I'm good. I'll hold. Reese sat down on the rock next to where the architect was sitting and did something he almost never did in the field. He just stayed still for a moment. Let the mission exist around him without pushing against it. Let the 18 minutes be 18 minutes. And he thought about a woman he had never seen on a ridge he could barely locate in the dark, who had been alone and invisible for 3 days, who had fired 14 shots in 12 minutes, and changed everything who was tired and was holding anyway. He thought about what Hayes must have been like as a teacher. He thought about what kind of person comes out the other end of that training. He thought that when this was over, when they were back at the FOB and the after-action reports were written, and the intelligence from those drives was in the hands of the analysts who would spend weeks pulling it apart, there was going to be a conversation about Emily Carter. A serious conversation, the kind that had consequences and momentum. He looked at the architect who was also sitting quietly, also looking out at the mountain. "You said you expected this to end in one of two ways," Reese said. "I did," the man said. "Did either of those ways include what actually happened?" The architect was quiet for a moment, a long moment, the longest pause he had taken since Reese found him at the table. "No," he said finally. "Good," Reese said, and they sat there together in the dark, captor and prisoner, waiting for the sound of rotors. And on the mountain above them, invisible to both of them, to everyone, Emily Carter settled her rifle into a position she could hold for 18 more minutes. And she breathed and she watched, and she held the line that nobody had asked her to hold, but that she had decided 3 days ago on a rocky ridge in the Hindu Kush was hers to hold regardless. The way some people just do, the way some people always have. The way that nobody makes a monument to, because the people who do it are never standing still long enough to be memorialized. They are always already on the next ridge, already watching, already there before anyone knew they needed to be. The helicopter arrived 17 minutes and 53 seconds after Reese called it in. He knew the exact time because he had been watching the seconds the way you watch seconds, when every one of them is a variable, a moving enemy element, a shift in wind, a decision someone on the mountain is making that you cannot see and cannot control, but that is going to affect everything that happens next. When the rotors finally cut through the dark from the northeast and the bird dropped fast and low toward the ridgeline in the particular aggressive descent that extraction pilots use when they know the ground situation is not resolved, Reese felt something release in his chest that he hadn't fully acknowledged was there. Not relief. Not yet. Relief was for when the wheels left the ground, but something adjacent to relief. The first breath after holding your breath for a long time. "On your feet," Danny said to the architect, not harshly but without any softness in it either, and the man stood without argument and let himself be moved toward the landing zone with the same cooperation he had maintained since the compound. Webb had his bag secured. Flores was already moving toward the bird eyes, still backward, still covering the approach routes, because his job didn't end until he was inside the aircraft, and even then not entirely. The crew chief was visible in the door, waving them in with the controlled urgency of someone who has done this hundreds of times and knows exactly how much time they have on the ground and is already counting it down. Reese went last. He was always last. He keyed his radio as he moved toward the bird. "Carter, we're loading. 60 seconds. "Copy," Emily said. "No movement on any vector. You're clear. What's your extraction plan?" A pause. "I'll move to my pre-planned extraction point. Coordinates are on file with Bravo Control. I have a 2-hour walk." 2 hours, lone, on foot. After 72 hours of static observation followed by the most operationally intense 30 minutes Reese had witnessed in 6 years of special operations. "Bravo Control is going to want to come get you," he said. "Tell them I'll call when I'm at the extraction point," she said. "I move better alone." Reese stopped walking for exactly 1 second. Just one. Then he kept moving toward the bird. "Carter." "Sir." "Outstanding work tonight." The pause that followed was the longest she had taken with him on any transmission that wasn't a targeting calculation. When her voice came back, it was still level, still controlled, but there was something in it. Not softness exactly, but something that existed in the same neighborhood as softness. Something human and tired and real in a way that all her precision hadn't allowed through until now. "Thank you, sir. Get your people home." He climbed into the helicopter. The crew chief pulled the door. The bird lifted. And below them, somewhere on the dark mountain that was already becoming indistinct and anonymous in the way mountains look from the air at night, Emily Carter was alone again. Moving, invisible. 2 hours from the place where someone would come to bring her in. Reese watched the mountain until it disappeared behind the horizon. He thought, "I never saw her face." He thought, "I don't know if I ever will." He thought, "It doesn't matter." The flight back to the forward operating base took 41 minutes. Nobody slept. Nobody talked much. The architect sat with his hands zip-tied and his eyes open and his expression exactly as it had been in the compound, patient, observant, carrying the particular stillness of a man who has already moved through the stage of the situation where emotions are useful and has arrived at the stage where only thinking is useful. Webb spent the flight with his field reader, working through the drives they had pulled from the compound table, and his expression got progressively more serious in a way that Reese watched from across the aircraft without asking about, because the look on Webb's face told him that what was on those drives was significant enough to wait for a proper debrief rather than a shouted conversation over rotor noise. Danny Okafor sat with his rifle across his knees and his head back against the aircraft frame and his eyes closed and looked for all the world like he was asleep. He wasn't. Reese knew Danny well enough to know what his sleeping face looked like, and this wasn't it. This was the face Danny made when he was processing something he wasn't ready to put into words yet. The face of a man running a very large file through a very thorough internal review. Flores checked his medical kit twice, not because anything in it had changed, because it was what he did when he needed to do something with his hands. They landed at the FOB at 0522. The debrief began at 0544. The room was small and full of people who had not been on the mountain and therefore had a fundamentally different relationship with the events of the last several hours than the four men who had. There was the mission coordinator, a major named Calloway, who was precise and thorough and occasionally tone-deaf about the gap between what an operation looks like on a planning board and what it feels like when you're inside it. There was an intelligence officer Reese didn't know, a woman in her late 30s with a notepad and the kind of careful listening posture that meant she wasn't going to miss anything. There was a colonel from the brigade staff who was there because the potential magnitude of what was on those drives had already been flagged, and people at that level appeared when magnitude was flagged. Reese laid it out from the beginning. He was good at this, at taking something that had been kinetic and chaotic and emotionally loaded and translating it into the kind of clean, sequential narrative that a debrief required. He gave times, he gave positions, he gave decisions and the reasoning behind each one. He described the 7 sniper positions and how they had been detected and what the tactical situation had looked like from the observation point. And then he got to the radio contact. At approximately 0403, he said, I received an unsolicited transmission on the mission net from a call sign identifying as Overwatch 1, Marine Scout Sniper Sergeant Emily Carter, 2nd Battalion, 7th Marines. Major Calloway looked up from his notes. Overwatch 1 wasn't on your tasking order. I'm aware of that, sir. There was no Overwatch element attached to your operation. I'm also aware of that, sir. Then how? I'd suggest that's a question for someone with visibility on Sergeant Carter's original tasking, Reese said. He kept his voice neutral and professional. But there was something underneath the neutrality that anyone in the room paying attention could detect. A line, not aggressive, just clear. He was not going to allow this part of the debrief to become an interrogation of a decision that had saved his team. What I can tell you is that she had been in position for 72 hours before we arrived. She had complete observational data on all 7 threat positions. She offered to suppress the threat positions to enable our advance on the objective. I assessed her plan as sound and authorized her to proceed. You authorized a Marine NCO who wasn't on your tasking order to conduct a sniper suppression operation in your AO, Calloway said. Yes, sir, Reese said. And 6 minutes later, my team was alive and moving toward the objective. The room was quiet for a moment. The colonel from brigade, who had not yet said anything, looked up. He was a large man with the kind of face that had seen enough operational history to recognize what it was looking at. He looked at Reese for a moment and then looked at Calloway. Move on, Major, he said quietly. Calloway moved on. When Reese finished the tactical narrative and Webb laid out the preliminary assessment of the drive contents names, network maps, financial routing, information, cell leadership identities, spanning 7 provinces and 4 countries. The room changed temperature in the way rooms change temperature when the people in them suddenly understand the scale of what they're dealing with. The intelligence officer had stopped writing. Her pen was still on the page, but she wasn't moving it. She was staring at Webb's summary with an expression that combined professional training with something more immediate and human. The expression of someone doing rapid involuntary math about what the information in front of them could mean if used correctly. She started, then stopped. Started again. If this is authentic, this is potentially the most significant intelligence capture in this theater in 3 years. If, the colonel said. The sourcing is direct, Webb said. These aren't secondhand documents. These were on drives in the man's personal compound. His operational security was exceptional by any standard. This is not the kind of material that gets left accidentally. He paused. He didn't expect to be leaving without it. Reese glanced at the door that connected to the holding room, where the architect was currently being processed by the HVT handling team. Through the wall, he could not see or hear anything. But he was aware of the man's presence, the way you become aware of certain presences, not through sensation, but through the particular quality of the air around a thing that has weight and consequence. He's going to talk, Danny said from the corner of the room. He had not been asked to contribute to the debrief at this point, but nobody moved to stop him. He's going to talk because he's been calculating since the moment we found him. He knows what he has to offer, and he knows what offering it is worth. The intelligence officer looked at Danny. What makes you say that? He told me he'd been captured before, Danny said. Men who've been captured before and who have survived it have made a decision about how they operate in that situation. He's already made his. He was making it on the helicopter. Calloway looked like he wanted to redirect the debrief back to his notes. The colonel's expression suggested he found Danny's read more valuable than Calloway's notes. The intelligence officer was already writing something. It was at 07:15, an hour and 31 minutes into the debrief, that Emily Carter's name came up again. Not from Reese, not from Danny or Webb or Flores, from Calloway, and not gently. Sergeant Carter's presence in your AO and her involvement in this operation are going to require a separate review, he said, consulting his notes in the way that people consult notes when they're about to say something they've prepared and want to appear to be saying spontaneously. Her original tasking was a separate reconnaissance mission with a different objective and a strictly defined operational boundary. Her decision to engage the 7 sniper positions, while arguably effective, was a significant departure from her authorized scope of action. The room shifted. Not dramatically, not with anyone raising a voice or standing up or doing anything that would photograph badly. The shift was subtler than that. It was the shift that happens in rooms where people with experience in what decisions actually look and feel like in the field encounter people who are reviewing those decisions from a chair in a clean building, and the gap between those two things becomes briefly uncomfortably visible. Reese kept his voice very flat. Major, with respect. Sergeant Carter informed me of the threat. She presented a plan. I authorized it. If there is a scope of action question on this operation, it sits with me, not with her. The authorization question is actually separate from I authorized it, Reese said again. Same flatness, same clarity, same line. The colonel was looking at Reese. Something in the colonel's look said, I see what you're doing, and I respect it, and it may or may not be sufficient, and we're going to find out. We'll table that discussion, the colonel said to Calloway. Then to the room, what's Carter's current status? Bravo Control checked his terminal. She called in from her extraction point at 0648. Recovery team is en route. ETA to FOB is approximately 90 minutes, which meant Emily Carter would walk into this building at approximately 0830, into a room where a major with careful notes was waiting to ask her questions about her scope of action. After 72 hours on a mountain and the most operationally significant 30 minutes of anyone's career in this building, Reese thought about that. He thought about the particular cruelty of institutions, not malicious cruelty, not intentional cruelty, but the bureaucratic kind, the procedural kind, the kind that doesn't know it's cruel because it's operating from a framework that was built for different situations by people who have never been in the situations they're building frameworks for. He thought about what Hayes might have told her to expect, whether he had prepared her for this part, the part after the mountain. He thought that the mountain was probably easier. He excused himself from the debrief at 0749 and found a quiet corner of the operations center and called his superior commander, Janet Oakes, who was physically located 300 miles away at a joint operations center and who had received the highlights of the night's events through official channels, but not through Reese's voice. When she picked up, she said, "Tell me what happened." He told her. He didn't leave anything out. He described Emily the same way he had described everything else, with times and positions and decisions and the reasoning behind each one. But when he got to the parts that didn't fit neatly into the timeline, the 72 hours of observation, the 12-minute sequence, the malfunction and recovery, the repositioning in 90 seconds in the dark, the final shot on the seventh sniper that ended mid-transmission, his voice changed slightly. Not unprofessionally, just slightly. When he finished, Oakes was quiet for a moment. "And Calloway wants to review her scope of action," she said. "Yes, ma'am." "And you told him the authorization sits with you?" "Yes, ma'am." "Which it does." "Which it does." Another pause. Then David, the drives. Webb's preliminary count is somewhere above 300 individual names, full organizational mapping, financial channels. He heard Oakes exhale. Not dramatically, just the small, involuntary exhale of someone processing a number that recalibrates their understanding of what a single night's work can mean. The asset himself, cooperative, calculating. I think he's going to be willing to build on what's on the drives if the terms are right. "Terms will be someone else's problem," Oakes said. "The intelligence community is going to own that conversation before this afternoon." "Yes, ma'am." "And Carter is inbound. Should arrive here at approximately 0830. "I'm going to make a call," Oakes said. It was not a statement that invited discussion. It was the kind of statement that closed a chapter and opened a new one. "You focus on your team, make sure they're fed and rested, and that Flores has checked everyone over medically. Then I want you in that room when Carter arrives. Not at Calloway's elbow, in that room." "Yes, ma'am." "David." "Ma'am." "Good work." She ended the call. Reese stood in the quiet corner of the operations center and looked at the wall for a moment. Then he went to find his team. He found them in the chow hall, Danny with a plate of something that passed for eggs, Webb still running analysis on his laptop despite having been awake for over 20 hours, Flores with his hands wrapped around a cup of coffee and his eyes doing the thing they did when he was decompressing, when the medic brain that stayed in emergency mode through an operation was slowly, carefully releasing itself back into ordinary wakefulness. Reese sat down with him. He didn't say anything for a moment. He just sat there. And the thing about a team that has been through something significant together is that sitting together without talking is its own language, and everyone at that table was fluent in it. Finally, Danny said, "She's really coming here." "Oh, 8:30, Reese said. "I want to meet her," Danny said. It was simple, direct, not sentimental, just honest. The statement of a man who has been kept alive by someone he has never seen and has a very basic human need to look that person in the face. "You will," Reese said. Webb looked up from his laptop. "I've been through more of the drives," he said. He paused. It was the pause of a man choosing his words with the particular care you use when the information you're carrying is too large to release all at once. "There's something on them that wasn't in my preliminary assessment. Something I need to flag to the intel officer, and I will. But I wanted you all to hear it first." He turned the laptop so they could all see the screen. They looked at it. Danny set his fork down. Flores set his coffee down. Reese looked at the screen for a long moment and then looked at Webb. "Is that what I think it is?" Reese said. "Yes," Webb said. The architect wasn't just coordinating weapon supply. He was running a targeting program. Specific individuals, specific patterns of surveillance, building operational profiles on high-value targets for future operations. He tapped the screen. "These are names, American names, and this," he indicated a section of a document on the screen. "This is a timeline." "A timeline for what?" Flores said quietly. Webb looked at him. "For operations against those names. Some of them in-country, some of them back home." The chow hall noise continued around them, oblivious. Someone across the room laughed at something. The breakfast service was running. The world was doing its ordinary morning things, and at their table, 4 men were sitting with the knowledge that what had been pulled from a mountain compound in Kannar province in the last several hours had just expanded from a regional intelligence capture to something with dimensions that reached across an ocean. "She stopped more than she knew she was stopping," Danny said quietly. It wasn't directed at anyone in particular. It was just a man saying a true thing that needed to be said. "She stopped what she came to stop," Reese said. "And then she stopped what she stayed to stop. There, the rest of it?" He looked at the laptop screen. "That's for the analysts." He checked his watch. 0804, 26 minutes. He stood up. Finish eating. Webb, get that to the intel officer now. That can't wait. Danny Flores, when you're done, wash up and be outside the debrief room at 0825. Why 0825? Danny said. Because I want us to be there when she walks in, Reese said, before Calloway gets to her. Danny nodded. Good thinking. He was there at 0822, Flores and Danny at 0824. At 0831, the outer door of the operations building opened and a Marine Scout sniper sergeant named Emily Carter walked in. Reese had tried on some level not to construct a picture of her in his head. He knew from long experience that the pictures you construct never match the reality, and the gap between them always produces a moment of disorientation that he preferred to avoid. But the mind does what it does, and over the last 3 hours, an image had formed itself in the space where he had nothing else to put. He let it go when she walked in. Not because she didn't look capable, she looked more than capable. She looked like someone who had spent 72 hours on a mountain and had walked 2 hours in the dark and still entered a building with the posture of someone who was fully present. But because the picture he'd built was a composite of ideas, and what walked in was a specific person with specific eyes that took in the room in one sweep and found him immediately and stopped. He crossed to her. She was 28 years old, which he already knew. But standing 3 feet from him, she looked both older and younger than that number, older in the eyes, younger in the way that people who spend enormous energy maintaining control sometimes look unguarded in the first moment of genuine safety. He extended his hand. She shook it. Her grip was what you'd expect, firm, clean, not performative. Sergeant Carter, he said. Commander Reese, she said. And then Danny Okafor, who had been standing 4 feet away with his arms at his sides and an expression that was working very hard to remain professionally appropriate, said very quietly, I counted them through my optics. I counted all 7 going still, and I still don't completely understand how you did it. Emily looked at him. Something shifted in her expression. Not much, just enough. 72 hours of homework, she said. Danny made a sound that was almost a laugh. I'm going to tell my kids about this, he said. When I have kids, I'm going to tell them about this specific night. Emily didn't smile, but the thing that happened around her eyes when Danny said that was close enough to a smile that it counted. Reese looked at her. There's a debrief. Calloway's going to ask you about scope of action. I want you to know before you go in there that I have already told him on record that the authorization was mine. Emily looked at him for a moment. He could see her processing that, not surprised, not relieved, just integrating the information with the same economy she applied to everything else. I made my own decision, she said. I know you did, he said, and the record will show I authorized it. That's not me trying to take something from you. That's me making sure the paperwork matches the reality of how this operation worked. She was quiet for a moment. Then, Hayes always said the after-action report is its own kind of battle. Hayes was right, Reese said. You ready, Isaiah? She looked at the door to the debrief room. She had not slept in somewhere approaching 80 hours. She had spent 3 days on a rocky ridge in the Hindu Kush Mountains alone and invisible and watching, and then she had done something in 12 minutes that most people in her profession would spend the rest of their careers describing in training rooms as a benchmark of what was theoretically achievable under optimal conditions. And now she had to walk into a clean room and talk to a major with notes. Yes, she said. Reese believed her. He opened the door. And Emily Carter walked into the room the same way she had handled everything else about the last 3 days, without visible hesitation, without waiting to be sure, without anything in her bearing that suggested she was anything other than completely professionally prepared for whatever came next. Which was who she was. Which was who she had always been. Which was, Reese thought, as he followed her through the door, exactly the kind of person the mountain had not been able to stop and the enemy had not been able to find, and the institution was now going to have to figure out what to do with. And somewhere in the building behind a closed door, the man who had laughed at the thought of 8 Americans dying on his mountain was about to begin a very different kind of conversation. And on the drives that Webb had carried down from that compound, 300 names waited in the dark like a problem that had been given a solution before it knew it needed one. Because a woman with a rifle and 72 hours of patience had climbed a mountain that no one sent her to, and stayed on it until the job was done. The debrief lasted 4 hours and 19 minutes. Reese knew because he was in the room for all of it. Sitting to Emily's left, not speaking unless Calloway directed a question specifically at him, which the major did 6 times. The other 340-some minutes belonged to Emily, and she handled them the way she handled everything else, with a precision and economy that left very little room for misinterpretation and no room at all for the kind of narrative drift that debriefs sometimes fell into when the person being questioned was tired or defensive or trying to manage an outcome rather than simply report what happened. Emily was not managing an outcome. She was reporting facts. And the facts laid out in sequence with times and positions and decision points, and the reasoning behind each one were extraordinary enough on their own that they didn't require any management. Calloway pushed on the scope of action question 3 times. The first time Emily answered it directly, she had assessed that her original tasking had been overtaken by a developing threat to American personnel, and she had made a command decision to address that threat. The second time Calloway pushed, she said the same thing with slightly different words. The third time she said, "Major, I understand the question. I've answered it twice. My answer isn't going to change because the facts didn't change." The room went very quiet. Calloway looked at his notes. The colonel from brigade, who had returned for this debrief, looked at Emily with an expression that Reese could not fully read, but that contained, he thought, something in the vicinity of recognition. The look of a person who has seen a quality before and is seeing it again and knows exactly what it is. "Let's move on," the colonel said. Calloway moved on. When it was over, when the last question had been asked and the last answer had been recorded, and Calloway had closed his notebook with the specific finality of a man who is done talking but not done thinking, Emily stood up and Reese stood with her, and they walked out of the room together into the corridor. And Emily stopped walking and put one hand against the wall and just stood there for a moment with her eyes closed. Not collapsing, not losing it, just stopping. The way a machine stops when the task that was running it completes and the system needs a moment before the next task loads. Reese stood next to her and said nothing. After approximately 8 seconds, she opened her eyes. "That," she said, "was harder than the mountain." "It always is," Reese said. She looked at him. "Does it get easier? The mountain or the debrief?" "Either." He thought about it honestly because she deserved an honest answer, and he could tell she would recognize anything less. "The mountain gets more familiar. The debrief gets more navigable. Neither one gets easy." She nodded. It was the nod of someone filing information rather than seeking comfort. "Get some sleep," Reese said. "Whatever happens next, and things are going to happen, there are people above Calloway who are going to want to talk to you, and they are going to be considerably less focused on procedure. It will be better after sleep." "I know," she said. She pushed off the wall and walked toward the accommodations. She didn't look back. She walked the way she did everything directly, without wasted motion, without the performance of anything she didn't feel. Reese watched her go and thought about the gap between what that woman had just done and what this morning had asked her to sit through, and he found the gap genuinely offensive in a way that he knew was not useful to dwell on, but that was real nonetheless. Then he went to find the colonel. He found him at 01237 in the operations center, standing over Webb's shoulder, looking at a screen that Reese now knew contained portions of the architect's drive contents, specifically the targeting program Webb had surfaced that morning in the chow hall. The intelligence officer was there too, and 2 people Reese didn't recognize who had the particular look of individuals who had been traveling for several hours and had arrived with a specific and urgent purpose. The colonel looked up when Reese entered. "Close the door," he said. Reese closed the door. "These 2 are from DIAO," the colonel said, indicating the 2 people Reese didn't know. "They've been read in on the drive contents. They have some things they need to tell us," he paused, "about the targeting program specifically." The DIA officer on the left, a woman mid-40s, the kind of professional composure that comes from years of managing information that most people never see, looked at Reese and said, "Commander, the targeting program among those drives is not a future tense document. Some of the operations it describes have already been executed. Partially." Reese went still. "What does partially mean?" "It means the surveillance phases were completed. The operational planning was completed. What was missing were the final authorizations, which apparently required the architect's direct sign-off." She paused. "He was the release authority for the domestic operations specifically. Without him, those operations are currently suspended." "Currently," Reese said. "Currently," she confirmed. "There are individuals in his network who have the operational knowledge to proceed without his authorization. The question is whether they will and how quickly, and whether we can use what's on those drives to get ahead of them. How many people are on the domestic list? Reese said. 17 names, the second DOA officer said. He was younger, sharp-eyed, with the slightly exhausted quality of someone who had been running on urgency for the last several hours. 11 military, 4 intelligence community, 2 civilian contractors with defense affiliations. Reese processed this. And you're moving on it. We're moving on it, the woman confirmed. The information from those drives has already been distributed to the relevant counterterrorism and law enforcement agencies. Protective details are being assigned. Network identification is underway. She looked at him steadily. This is what I need you to understand, Commander. What came off that mountain last night, the drives, the asset, the intelligence, is going to prevent attacks. Specific plan, partially executed attacks against specific people. Some of those people have no idea they were on a list. The room was quiet. Reese thought about the compound, about the table with the drives on it, about the architect sitting with his hands flat on that table with a small patient smile, knowing exactly what was sitting 6 inches from his fingertips and what it would mean if it walked out of that room in American hands. He had let it happen, not because he couldn't stop it. He could have reached for it before Reese's team entered the window was there. He could have destroyed the drives. He could have made that calculation and made the other choice. He hadn't. And Reese had been turning that over in his head since the helicopter ride and had been unable to land on a clean explanation. The man was not careless. The man was not caught off guard. The man had known someone was coming, had built a sophisticated defensive network in anticipation, had a mobile reserve element staged and ready. He was not a man who forgot about the drives on his table. He left them, Reese said. The DIA woman looked at him. I'm sorry. The drives, he left them. He had time. He could have destroyed them or taken them with him. He didn't. Reese looked at her. He sat down at that table and he put his hands flat and he waited. Silence. What are you suggesting? The colonel said. I'm suggesting, Reese said carefully, that whatever conversation the intelligence community is about to have with that man about cooperation and terms, they should go into it understanding that he may have already decided what he's cooperating toward, that the drives may be an opening offer. The DIA officers exchanged a look. Not surprised. The look of people who had already considered this and were mildly interested to find that a Navy SEAL had arrived at the same place through field observation rather than analytical process. That assessment is consistent with our preliminary raid, the woman said. Then you already knew, Reese said. We suspected, she said. Your confirmation is useful. He thought about what Danny had said in the debrief room. He's already made his decision. He was making it on the helicopter. He thought about experience, about what enough time in a profession does to a person's decision-making architecture, about men who had been captured before and survived it and built a framework for how to survive it again. The architect had walked into captivity with a plan, which meant nothing about this operation from the moment the architect designed his sniper network to the moment he sat down at the table with his hands flat had been accidental, possibly including the partial transmission from Sniper 7, possibly including the mobile reserve that hadn't moved fast enough, possibly including all of it. Reese said how much of what happened last night was what he wanted to happen. The DI. A woman's expression didn't change. That's the most important question on the table right now, she said, and we don't have an answer yet. But you're working on it. We are working on it. Reese looked at the colonel. The colonel looked back at him with the expression of a man who has learned over many years that the moment you think you understand the full shape of a situation is usually the moment the situation reveals another dimension. Is there anything else you needed from me right now? Reese said. Not at this moment, the colonel said. Go take care of your team. He went. He found Danny in the gym at 13:20, which surprised him not at all. Danny processed things physically. He had been doing it for as long as Reese had known him running or lifting or hitting a bag when his mind needed to work through something that words weren't adequate for. He was on a bench press when Reese walked in, moving weight with the controlled focus of a man who was not thinking about the weight. Reese sat on a nearby bench. Danny finished his set the bar, sat up. She handled Calloway, Danny said. It wasn't a question. She told him his question wasn't going to get a different answer the third time he asked it. Danny laughed, short and genuine. I like her. She's earned it, Reese said. What's the word on the drives? Reese told him. Not everything, some of it was compartmented above Danny's current clearance level, and Reese was not going to be the person who decided unilaterally that the compartment didn't apply in this case. Not today, not with everything still in motion. But enough. The domestic targeting list, the partially executed surveillance, the people who didn't know they were on a list. Danny listened without interrupting, which was how Danny listened to things that mattered. When Reese finished, Danny was quiet for a moment. Then, so she didn't just save us? No, Reese said. She saved people who don't even know they needed saving. Yes. Danny picked up a towel from the bench beside him and held it in his hands without doing anything with it. He looked at the floor. You know what gets me, he said. She was supposed to be on a different mission. Her actual tasking was something else. She wasn't even supposed to be watching that compound. I know, but she saw what was building, and she stayed. She adjusted, Reese said. That's the word she used. She adjusted. Danny looked up. Hayes taught her that. Hayes taught her a lot of things. I want to find Hayes, Danny said. I want to shake that man's hand. Reese almost said something about the chain of influence, about how the things a teacher builds in a student go further than the teacher ever knows, about how Hayes probably didn't know what Emily had done last night and wouldn't know for some time and would find out eventually through channels, the way people in that world find things out quietly, officially, years after the fact. But he didn't say it. It was too large for this moment, in this room, and Danny already understood it. He could see it in Danny's face. Instead, he said, get some rest. There's going to be more coming. There's always more coming, Danny said. Today more than usual. He found Flores in the medical bay at 014:05, not because Flores was injured, but because the medical bay was where Flores went when he needed to think, the same way the gym was Danny's place and the operations terminal was Webb's place. He was sitting on an exam table doing nothing, which for Flores was the equivalent of anyone else pacing. Reese sat in the chair across from him. How are you doing? Reese said. Flores looked at him. I keep thinking about the malfunction, he said. Reese waited. During the third engagement, her rifle malfunctioned. I didn't know that in real time. I found out in the debrief. But I keep replaying the timeline and finding the place where it happened, and I keep thinking about what that moment must have felt like. Alone on that ridge, fourth sniper, already detecting something, rifle not cycling, 6 down to go. She ran the drill, Reese said. In under 4 seconds, Flores said, with a target standing and a window closing. He paused. I train malfunction drills. I run them regularly. I don't know if I could do that in 4 seconds under those conditions. You haven't had 72 hours to prepare yourself for those specific conditions, Reese said. That's generous, Flores said. It's accurate, Reese said. Preparation is most of it. She'd been living in that operation for 3 days. Her nervous system was already calibrated to exactly the kind of problem she ran into. It wasn't luck. It was preparation meeting the moment. Flores was quiet. Then Hayes. Hayes, Reese agreed. It was becoming a kind of shorthand between them. A word that meant there is a chain here, a long one, and it runs through a teacher and a student and a mountain in Afghanistan and ends in consequences that are still unfolding. At 015:30, Reese's radio carried a message from the colonel's aide. He was wanted in the operations center. When he arrived, the DIA officers were still there, and the intelligence officer and the colonel, and one new face, a 2-star general who had apparently materialized from somewhere in the last 2 hours, and who looked at Reese with the particular directness of a person who has read everything there is to read about a situation and now wants to talk to the source. Commander Reese, the general said. General, Reese said. Sit down. He sat. I've read the after-action reports, yours and your team's. I've been briefed on the drive contents and the targeting program. I've spoken with the intelligence officer handling the asset. The general paused. I want to talk about Sergeant Carter. Yes, sir. The scope of action review that Major Calloway initiated is being suspended, the general said. Effective immediately. That review will not proceed. Reese kept his face neutral. Understood, sir. What will proceed, the general said, is a separate review of a different kind. A review of what Sergeant Carter did, how she did it, and what it means for how we think about certain categories of operation. He looked at Reese steadily. She was alone, no spotter, no support element. 72 hours of static observation followed by a 14-shot sequence in under 13 minutes, including a malfunction recovery, a repositioning under contact, and a final engagement not a moving target. All of that in support of an operation she wasn't tasked to. Yes, sir. What the Marine Corps does with that information is the Marine Corps' business, the general said. What I can tell you is that several people in this room and above this room are going to be thinking very carefully about what it means that one person with a rifle and 3 days of preparation was able to do what 7 trained snipers in a mobile reserve element could not prevent. Reese thought about the architect's words on the helicopter. I want you to understand, I have worked with highly trained military personnel for 20 years. What she just did is not something I have seen before. She'd say it was the homework, Reese said. The general looked at him. Meaning 72 hours of observation. She'd say that was the real work. The shooting was the result of the work, not the work itself. The general was quiet for a moment. Then Hayes trained her. It was not a question. Reese had no idea how the general knew that, but he was not surprised that the general knew it. People at that level knew things. It was part of what made them people at that level. Yes, sir, Reese said. Hayes retired 4 years ago, the general said. He's been consulting, teaching at a civilian level. Some contract work. He paused. He doesn't know yet what she did last night. Probably not, sir. He will, the general said, simply, like a fact about weather. Then he stood, which ended the meeting with the same efficiency that his presence had begun it, and Reese stood with him, and the general said one more thing before he walked out. She stayed on that mountain if the tasking was complete, the general said. Nobody ordered her to stay. Nobody would have blamed her if she'd extracted. She assessed the situation and she stayed. He looked at Reese. That's not training. Training can get you to the point where you're capable of making that choice. But the choice itself that comes from somewhere else. He left. The room breathed again. Reese sat back down and looked at nothing in particular for a moment, and he thought about the somewhere else the general had described. About where choices like that come from. About the conversation Hayes and Emily must have had at some point about the difference between completing a mission and completing an obligation. About the fact that Emily hadn't been able to explain it cleanly when she told Reese she was going to stay, that she had just stayed, that the explanation came later, if it came at all. He thought about the 7 sniper mid-transmission, 2 clicks of warning sent into the dark. He thought about how close it had been. How many seconds had existed between the world where those 2 clicks were enough and the world where they weren't. He thought that history was made of those seconds. That the whole shape of events of wars of intelligence, networks of 17 people who didn't know they were on a list, pivoted on intervals so small that no planning document would ever acknowledge them, because planning documents were built on the assumption that what could be controlled would be controlled, and the truth was that what couldn't be controlled was always the thing that mattered most. What couldn't be controlled was a woman on a ridge who had decided 3 days ago that she wasn't going anywhere until it was finished. He found her at 17:15. She was awake, which meant she had slept approximately 3 hours, and had apparently decided that 3 hours was sufficient for the current situation. She was sitting in the common area outside the accommodations with a cup of coffee and a notepad, and she was writing something in the notepad in a small, precise hand. She looked up when he sat across from her. The scope review is suspended, he said. She looked at him. Something shifted very briefly in her expression. Not relief, not vindication, something quieter than either of those. Something that looked like the absence of attention she hadn't fully acknowledged carrying. Okay, she said. There's going to be a different kind of review, he said. The good kind, above Calloway's level. She nodded. And the drives, he said. Webb found something this morning. I don't know how much you've been told. Some of it, she said. The intel officer came to see me an hour ago. She held her coffee with both hands and looked at it for a moment. The targeting list. Yes. 17 people who didn't know, she said. Yes. She was quiet. He watched something move through her expression, not slowly but in layers, the way emotion moves through people who are accustomed to processing it efficiently rather than dwelling in it. She had not been on that mountain to save 17 people she would never meet. She had been there to do a specific job inside a specific operational boundary, and then she had stayed to do something more immediate, something she could see directly and act on directly. The larger consequence, the drives, the names, the targeting program, that was something that existed at a distance from the ridge. The kind of distance that's hard to feel the full weight of. In the same way you feel the weight of 8 men crouched in the dark, 12 minutes away from dying. Hayes used to say, she said slowly, that you never know the full shape of what you're doing when you're doing it, that the shape only becomes visible later, and usually from a direction you didn't expect. He sounds like someone worth knowing, Reese said. He's worth knowing, she said. There was something in her voice when she said it. Not sentimentality exactly, but the particular warmth that comes from a genuine debt acknowledged without pretense. He's going to hear about this eventually. He is, Reese said. I'm not looking forward to that conversation, she said. Reese looked at her. Why not? She was quiet for a moment, then, because he's going to tell me what I did wrong. He's going to go through the entire sequence, and he's going to find the places where I had a better option that I didn't take, or a decision I made slower than I should have, or a risk I accepted that was larger than it needed to be. And he's going to be right. And I'm going to have to sit there and listen to it and take notes and know that he's right, and I should have seen it myself. Reese looked at her for a long moment. That he said is the most Marine thing anyone has said to me in 6 years. Something happened at the corners of Emily Carter's mouth. Small, quick, real. For the first time since she had walked into that building, she smiled. It lasted approximately 2 seconds. Then it was gone, replaced by the professional composure that was her default, and that Reese now understood was not coldness or distance, but simply the face she wore when she was fully engaged with the world. What happens now, she said. For you, he thought about it. Rest, debrief again. People above the general are going to want to talk to you. The Marine Corps is going to have opinions. There are going to be recommendations made and decisions taken about what this operation means and what it should lead to. He paused. It's going to take a while. And the team? Same basic architecture, he said. More debriefs. The asset is going to be talking to people for months. The drives are going to keep generating questions. He looked at her. You're going to hear about it. The shape of what you did, it's going to keep revealing itself. You're going to find out things about what last night meant that you don't know yet. She looked at her coffee. I already know what it meant, she said quietly. He waited. It meant that 8 people came home, she said. The rest of it, the drives, the names, all of it, that's important. I understand it's important. But when I was on that ridge, that wasn't what I was thinking about. 8 people in the dark who couldn't see the thing that was going to kill them. And I could. She looked up at him. That's all it was. Reese held that for a moment. Then he said the only thing that was adequate, which was not much, but which was enough. Yes, he said, that's all it was. Danny found them there 20 minutes later and pulled up a chair without being invited because that was Danny and nobody objected. Flores arrived shortly after. Webb sent a message saying he would be there in 10 minutes and arrived in 12. They sat together in the common area of a forward operating base in Afghanistan. 5 people who had not known each other 36 hours ago, and they talked. Not about the operation, not directly, not analytically, about other things, about where they were from, about the people waiting for them at home, about the particular strangeness of doing something in the dark that only the 5 of them fully understood, and knowing that the understanding would be distributed slowly and incompletely to everyone outside that circle for as long as any of them lived. Danny told a story about his first deer hunt in the hill country. Webb talked about his daughter, who was 4 years old and currently convinced that the moon followed her specifically wherever she went. Flores described his mother's cooking with a kind of precision and affection that made everyone at the table briefly homesick for a kitchen they had never visited. Emily listened more than she talked, but she was there, fully there in the way she was fully in every situation she occupied, present, attentive, not anywhere else. At one point, Danny said without particular lead-up, just as a thing that occurred to him, you know what I keep thinking about, the part where you said, when Reese asked you to identify yourself, you just said someone who can clear your path. That's what you said. Emily looked at him. That's what I was. That's exactly what you were, Danny said. That was the moment that stayed with all of them. Not the shots on the ridge, not the drives in the bag, not the debrief, or the general, or the DIA officers with their lists of 17 names. That small, plain, completely accurate sentence. That was the moment they all carried with them when they eventually went their separate ways. Someone who can clear your path. 8 people came home from a mountain that had been designed to kill them. 17 people never knew they had been crossed off a list they never knew they were on. And a woman who had spent 3 days invisible on a rocky ridge in the dark, who had made a decision that nobody ordered, and nobody would have faulted her for not making, carried all of it with the same economy and precision she brought to every other calculation. Not because she was extraordinary in the way that word is usually used in the monument-building, speech-giving, photograph-taking way, but because she was the person who saw the thing that needed doing and she did it. That is the oldest kind of courage there is. It has no gender and no rank and no ceremony. It only has a decision made alone in the dark by someone who understood that some obligations do not wait for orders. Emily Carter made that decision, and everyone she protected came home.